seminar today. It's a pleasure for us to receive to Mattia Ricci from the Joint Research Center of the European Commission. Sorry, I have in here the information about his background. He holds a PhD in economics from the University of Glasgow. Previously, he studied also at University Carlos III de Madrid. He has been working for several institutions, among others, has been economic advisor for the UK communication regulator, also from the UK independent fiscal institution, the Fiscal Commission, for the sake of concreteness. So I think his background is more than enough for giving us a complete intuition about the topic we are going to face today. So it's a pleasure for us to organize this seminar. So very thank you for coming here, and the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Well, the length of the talk in principle is about 40 minutes. Okay, so after that we will have a round of questions, and we could debate about the most interesting issues. Okay.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Jesus. Thank you very much, everybody, and for inviting me. It's very nice to be here. Always nice to be in Madrid as well. So I'll now share my presentation. Okay, thank you. Also, maybe taking the chance to say that if you want me to, I don't know if this is the way it works, but for me, if you want me to interrupt during the presentation, I don't really mind if you have questions. So the paper I'm presenting today is the redistributive impact of consumption taxation in the EU, lesson from the post-financial crisis decade. This is a joint work with a colleague of mine, Sophia Meyer, which is also working at the Joint Research Center in Sevilla with me. So let me jump directly into our work. So why consumption taxation and why the post-financial crisis decade? Well, consumption taxation is a crucial source of revenues, right, for European government. On average, in the EU, it accounts about a third of the fiscal revenue raised by the government from households. And the post-financial crisis decade, it's quite of a key period for consumption taxation, because we have seen in most of European countries a significant increase in the use of consumption taxes. And these were because of a number of factors. Those factors included austerity policies, particularly between 2010 and 2014, where a number of European governments trying to raise revenues, fiscal revenues, to consolidate the public finances following the sovereign debt crisis. But also because there was a consensus on tax shift, as in a consensus on using consumption taxes, on shifting the burden of taxation away from labor toward consumption in order to promote growth and employment. And also an increased use of consumption taxation to force consumer to internalize the cost of externalities, such as those related with drinking, smoking, and consuming polluting forms of energy. Looking to the future, so looking at the decade to come, chances are that consumption taxation will have an even more prominent role. And why is this? Well, because we will have to face the fiscal consequences of COVID-19, which have meant large public deficit for a number of European countries. Public deficit, by the way, probably will be aggravated by the ongoing energy crisis, where now governments are spending lots of money for things such as price cap and social transfer to family in order to help them to shelter the cost of inflation and of energy inflation. But also because of the European Green Deal, which is seeking to promote the transition to net zero emission by 2050, and is planning to use taxation as one of the levers to force consumer and company to move to a cleaner form of energies, and also health ambitions. So one of the bills passed by the EU, recent bill, is the EU Beating Cancer Plan, which foresee, for example, by 2040, to have less than 5% of the European population smoking. And again, consumption taxation, it's one of the levers that will be used. So what does the literature say about consumption taxation? Well, I think there is a vast body of public finance which suggests that the use of consumption taxation might be efficient and might be an effective way to stimulate growth and employment. And on the other hand, the consumption taxes do not come without trade-off. No, and particularly there is a body of cross-country studies that find consumption taxes to be regressive, and selected groups such as poor, household and income support to be specifically affected by the consumption taxation. Other insight is that while virtually all consumption taxes are regressive, there are some consumption taxes which are far more aggressive than others because of difference in consumption patterns within countries. No? For example, taxes on tobacco. Why? Because smokers are highly represented among disadvantaged income groups. And also, on the other hand, there are some features of consumption taxation, for example, the presence of reduced rates on things such as food in some countries that might reduce the regressive. So in this context, what we have in our paper is that while it is true that we have numerous evidence on the effect of consumption taxation, there is much work that can be done in terms of comparing its impact on household across member states, and there is much to be learned on the experience of different European countries. The EU is 27 countries, and there is much scope to learn from the experience of one another at the time of policy making and at the time of pursuing multiple objectives, such as, for example, efficiency and redistribution. And this is particularly the case because, as I just said, consumption taxes are not all equally regressive. Tax rules vary significantly across the EU. So again, member states are likely to feature different distributive outcome, and that's where we can learn from. No? Also, one thing that we try to do with respect of some of the literature I was discussing is to consider consumption taxation in the broader tax system, right? Because even if consumption taxation is regressive, it's also true that in theory, possibility exists to compensate poorer household via, for example, social transfers. No? Again, however, it's not clear which member state has been successful in doing this in these decades and which member states are successful in doing this today. So this is the context, and what we do is we use the model that we have, which is Euromod, which is the micro-simulation model of the European Union, to investigate the redistributive impact of the EU tax system, with particular focus on consumption taxation, and which particular focus on the reforms that took place between 2010 and 2019, the post-financial crisis decade. And we look at the dynamics of consumption taxation and its impact within the broader benefit tax system, right? And then we analyze the characteristics of the EU consumption tax system at the end of this decade, in 2019, after this decade of tax changes. And we look at things, for example, of how tax burden vary and regressivity vary across member states, and whether if countries with higher consumption taxes redistribute less. And we're trying to learn some policy lesson from this evidence and this exercise. Now, let me say a few words more about the model. By the way, the model Euromod is publicly available and is released twice a year. So we use, I said, Euromod. Euromod is the European Union tax and benefit micro-simulation model. The way this model works is quite simple, actually, is to take sample of representative household in each countries, which are provided by Estat in the EU Silk, so the survey on income and living condition, which provide information about labor market, demographic, family members for each household, for each European countries. And then we have a representative sample for each European member states. And over this sample, we just simulate the country-specific tax codes, tax rules, right? And in this way, what Euromod can do is to account for each tax benefit instrument in the tax code of each country, their possible interaction, and generate household disposable income, right? So starting from household earned income in the market, generate tax and benefit, and come up with the net income that household have to spending for consumption and savings. Now, Euromod does not account for consumption taxes. And the reason for that, the standard version of Euromod. And the reason for that is that we don't have information about what people consume. These are not part of EU Silk. And so to overcome this limitation, we have recently developed with our partner in Praxis, XX, and Leuven, an indirect tax extension of Euromod. And what the indirect tax extension does is to extend the scope of Euromod simulation to allow to simulate indirect taxes. And for doing that, we basically need an extended data set, which is a data set that includes not only the information from EU Silk, but also information on consumption, and also that coded the policy rules in terms of consumption for each country so that we can simulate the whole tax system from direct taxes all the way through indirect taxes. And I'm going to say a few words about that. But first, let me give you some graphical overview. So I think you can see the arrow, right? So this is Euromod, the standard Euromod. It takes as input market income, which is the sum of gross income from labor and capital for each household, and that are present in the input, standard input, which are EU Silk data. Then it simulates direct taxes, social insurance contribution, and cash transfers in each country, and it generates disposable income. And that's where it stops. Then the indirect tax tool extends Euromod because it contains an extended version of the dataset with consumption information by combining Silk with household budget survey, which is another service produced by Enstat. So it combines the two, and it applies the consumption tax rules in force in each country, right? And let me say a little words about the extended dataset, and then conscious of time, I will keep it simple on this dimension. But if you have a question, I can come back on it later on. What is the issue that basically we have in combining these two datasets? Well, the deal in combining the two datasets is that EU Silk contains information about labor market and demographics that we need for simulating direct taxes and social insurance contribution and social benefit. EU HBS contains information on consumption, but the households that are interviewed under this survey, Silk, are not the same as the one that are interviewed under HBS. So we cannot just simply directly link them. So we need to find a way to statistically match them. And we have a procedure, which is the kind of the next slide, but maybe I'll leave it to the end if there is time and if you have questions or more details. So we found a procedure to establish which is the closest household in the survey with consumption, which is HBS, to this counterpart in Silk. And then we associate them. And through this process of matching, we can then come up with households, combined data set where households have all the information that goes through demographic and labor market, but also on consumption. That's in a nutshell how we come up with, how we construct this combined data set. This is the matching procedure, leaving this for the end. And then let me say a word about how we assess using this tool, how we assess the impact of tax reform that took place in the post-financial crisis decade, so between 2010 and 2019. So, which is what then we refer in the results coming in the next slides. So what we do when we measure the impact of tax reform, which include consumption tax reform, but also direct tax reform, is we measure the pure effect of policy changes, right? So what we do is that we have one single data set, which is the data set of combined data set of HPS and Silk from 2010, right? And we measure the pure effect of policy changes. So we compare household income under 2010 and 2019 fiscal policy using the same data set, which is the data set 2010. So we basically keep the demographic, employment, and consumption share constant. So this approach, what it does is that it isolates the effect of policy changes, right? For example, increase in consumption taxation or increase in labor income taxation from the changes in which of the environment in which the policy operates, right? So because the demographic structure, the consumption structure are kept constant, right? And we do this for a couple of reasons. The first one is that we didn't have a choice because we don't have consumption data for 2019. The HPS data are released only with very large time gap. But also we try to make, starting from this limitation, we try also to, we also argue that it's not too bad, right? Because if you consider at the same time the change in the policies, but also the change in the labor market structure and the consumption structure, then the final effect that you observe, it's a bit complicated, right? Because, for example, you may see that social transfers increase, but there might just be the case that unemployment has increased. And because unemployment has increased, then more people receive unemployment benefits, right? That does not mean that unemployment benefits have become more generous or that government are implementing a higher measure of income support. It just means that there is higher unemployment, right? So in this way, since we keep everything else constant, we just change the policy, then we can really see the effect of the policy. And through the paper, when analyzing the effect of policy, we use the approach by Onrubia and Fidel. I hope we get it right. If not, it's my quote or fault. To decompose the redistributive effect of each tax and benefit reform and tax and benefit measure in terms of regressivity and say share of household income, say, and policy size, say. No. And here I'm just providing an example of a graph that then we use through the paper, not to analyze these changes, which is to say, for each policy measure, we can measure the distributive effect, which is the changes in the Gini coefficient under constant ranking before and after the policy. And this change can be decomposed in two ingredients, in two subcomponents. One is how progressive the policy is, and the other is the size of the policy itself, right? And the way we try to depict this is through this bubble graph, where we have on the x-axis the redistributive effect, right? Which is the change in Gini. How equalizing this policy was at the very end, no? And this effect depends on how progressive the policy is, right? So the higher the Kawani, the higher the progressivity, and how big in size, how big in terms of impact on household income the policy is. And this is what is captured by the size of the bubble, right? And it's important to take into account the size of the policy because this, for example, this example that we bring here, we might have two policies, say policy A and policy B, where policy A, actually, it's more progressive than policy B. But then, because policy A is smaller in magnitude, it redistributes less eventually than policy B. So policy B, which is less progressive, in the end has a more equalizing effect because it moves more money. And this is the framework that we would utilize through the paper to analyze the policy changes. Okay, how are we doing with time? Right.
It's a bit flexible.
Thank you. So let me now, having been through all the premises and the introduction, methodological introduction, let's go through the result and start looking at the main policy development which took place in the EU between 2010 and 2019. We look at the broader tax and benefit system, and then we zoom in into indirect taxes. Okay. Since there are 27 countries, I cannot show the graph for each country. So my strategy for here is to show EU, in many cases, EU averages, and then tells you through other figures and through comments, what are the common trends and what are elements of heterogeneity across member states. So let's have a look at the change in the tax burden and benefit receipt in the EU in these decades. No? Across the income distribution. Right? So we're looking here at how social benefit, direct taxes, social insurance contribution, and consumption taxes have changed, and what was their impact on household income across the income distribution. So what we see is that, well, the first things that is I would say evident is that all type of taxes have increased. So you see consumption taxes have increased, direct taxes have increased, social insurance contribution have increased, and they've increased, and they impact, and they have affected household across the income distribution. So everybody's paying more taxes, pretty much. Right? And this reasoning with our knowledge that this being mostly a decade of austerity, of using of taxation, of increasing taxation. And then the other thing is that social benefits have been overall reduced, right? However, if you look at the bottom of the distribution, there they have increased, right? Indicating that social benefit, while reducing in their overall size, they became more targeted toward the bottom of the income distribution, right? And the other thing is that if you look at the less well-off, so if you look at the bottom of the distribution, right? Well, it is the case that social benefit have increased, right? Their overall disposable income was reduced by the fact that other type of taxes have increased in a way that they more than offset the effect of social transfers. Right? And when we look at the redistributive impact of these changes, and we use the bubble graph that I show in the previous slides, right? So we see that substantially when changing from 2010 to 2019, what happened is that consumption taxes, social insurance, and direct taxes have all increased. All form of taxation has increased. That is the sign of the bubble. This is the size of the bubble becoming bigger, right? Benefit, on the other hand, have reduced. The size of the bubble is smaller. But they became more progressive because they are more targeted toward the bottom of the distribution. Right? Whereas on the other hand, consumption taxes had an equalizing effect because they have increased and also they became slightly more aggressive. So what we see effectively is that on average in the EU, the tax burden has increased. Social benefit have become more targeted. They were not enough to shelter the poorest household from digitalized increasing taxation. And although the movement of direct taxes and social insurance contribution were mostly although direct taxes and social insurance contribution were mostly shared in a progressive way, then everybody ended up losing by these tax hikes, including the poorest one. Now, as I said, this picture is for the EU as a whole, right? This is an average. Now, as an average, it reflects some common patterns, but it also conceals some heterogeneous dynamics, right? So what are the common elements? So if we're looking, and then at some point we will in a second, a picture of individual country, we would see that consumption taxes has increased virtually in all countries. So this is an element of commonality. Also, it is the case that in majority of the member states, benefit became more targeted toward the bottom of the income distribution. And this is actually in line with what were the indication of many international institutions, including the OECD, the Commission, which are like, look, make your tax benefit system more efficient by moving taxes toward consumption, but try to compensate the poorest by increasing social benefit at the bottom. Right? But on the other hand, again, in most cases, for most member states, if you look at the overall effect, the social transfer increase were not sufficient to shelter households from the increase in consumption taxation, as well as direct taxes and social insurance contribution. So these are all elements which are common, which are in the average and are common trend. Where the story becomes a bit more heterogeneous from country to country has to do with the relative movement of direct consumption taxes as opposed to direct taxes and social insurance contribution. So where the picture becomes more heterogeneous is on the tax shift. Whether countries have implemented or not, these shifting the burden of taxation away from labor toward consumption, right? And this we see here when we look at evidence of tax burden across European countries, and we look in particular at how the change in tax burden from consumption taxes has occurred in each country as opposed to the change in direct taxes, right? And then in this quadrant, the bottom right, we have the country which supposedly have implemented a tax shift, right? And it's because they have, on the one hand, they have increased consumption taxes while reducing direct taxes. Right? And there are a number of countries which have done that, but if you look at them, if you count them, they are basically a third of member states. So it's actually only a third of member states that have implemented this tax shift. In most of member states, what happened is that direct taxes, so taxes on labor, have increased as much or more than taxes on consumption. So this tax shift did not take place. And in particular, among those, there is a number of Eastern European countries such as Hungary, Lithuania, Slovakia, Czech Republic, which have been increasing direct taxes and social insurance contribution more or instead of consumption taxes. In some cases, as in Romania, actually most of the burden of consumption, most of the burden of taxation was moved to social insurance contribution. And by the way, when you talk with policymakers, this movement to social insurance contribution is also a politically convenient one, because social insurance contribution are more invisible than direct taxes and consumption taxes in many ways. There is an element of that. Now, this for what I just showed you, it's for what concern the broader tax and benefit system. Now, let's zoom in into the consumption tax development. No? And here, when I'm talking about consumption taxes, I'm talking about three types of taxes. I'm talking about VAT, value-added tax. We are talking about specific excises, which are taxes which are paid per quantum, right? So, for example, €3 for each package of cigarette. And then there are ad valorem excises, which are also, similarly to VAT, are also paid on the total expenditure. No? So if you spend €5 on the package of cigarette, ad valorem excise would be 20% of that value. Right? So, and here we look at how the change in the tax burden of VAT and excises, so consumption taxes are all, how the tax burden change in these decades, in the post-financial crisis decade. And what we see is that, well, first of all, consumption taxes increase pretty much everywhere in the EU. The component that increased the most and almost consistently across the member state are specific excises. And this is because what we were saying in the beginning, taxing energy, taxing alcohol, and taxing tobacco. If you look at these three categories of products, over these periods, the excises have grown far more than inflation. So in real terms, they have. Then we have VAT, which in most countries were used for fiscal consolidation purposes. There is a database from Alesina and co-author where they're trying to map this fiscal consolidation measure across member states, and you see that VAT hikes, increasing VAT are quite consistent component. And then we have ad valorem excises, which on the other hand have mostly reduced in most countries. In pretty much all countries, I think with the exception of Spain, actually, ad valorem excises are an extra tax on cigarette. And the reason they have reduced is because the European Commission has implemented in 2011 a revision of tobacco taxation, and has suggested member states to shift away from ad valorem excises to specific excises in taxing tobacco. Why? Well, because specific excises works best in incentivizing the consumption of tobacco because they are paid per quantum. So you pay X euro for every pack of cigarette. So effectively, they set a minimum price on a given product, alcohol, well, in this case, tobacco. Whereas ad valorem excises are a percentage, so like 50%, no? And then what they see from the experience of many countries that having these, even if this percentage is very high, say 50% of tax for each box of cigarette, then in practice it does not work this well, because you see that in the market, then they start enter manufacturer, we produce poor quality tobacco, which is even more harmful, at very low price, like €1, €2, etc. And then even if the tax is 50% to €1 is still 50 cents, so not very much. So then, and that's why we see most countries that ad valorem excises has pretty much reduced, because they've been fading away. Then we look, and I mean, we now consumption taxation have increased pretty much everywhere. Then if you look at the way that Cavani has changed, so the way of the progressivity of these taxes is that we see that in most member states, consumption taxes became not only increased, but they also became more aggressive. And then we look, sorry, I would like to, no, well, doesn't matter. And then we look at the effect by consumption category. Again, this is a EU average, okay? We use again the bubble graph. In this case, we are not looking at the level, we are looking at the change. So we are looking at the change in the distributive effect, progressivity, and size, as in tax burden, okay, of the taxation of these various consumption categories. Right? And we see that, well, the taxation that increased the most is the one of the taxation of transport, right? Which you see is the biggest bubble, so it's the one that increased the most. And if you look at, we have actually a parallel paper on taxation of energy products with my co-author. And if you look at how different energy products are taxed, the vehicle fuel, it's hugely taxed. So across the EU, it typically ranges between 60 and 80% when you take into account excises and VAT. So the implicit tax rate, the overall taxation. And the taxation really increased during these decades. But the effect is not that unequalizing, right? Because in fact, the taxation of transport is very, it's just slightly regressive. And this is because the case you have a lot of countries in Eastern Europe where the patterns of owning cars is such that vehicle taxation acts as a tax on the riches. And that is the case, for example, in Romania, where you have big chunk of the country which are rural, people stay there, do not move very much, and those that have cars are rich in the cities, and then when you increase taxes on fuel, you're basically taxing the rich. And this is a European average anyway. And then, but then we see that what really was unequalizing, so what really caused the most adverse change in the redistributive effect was the taxation of mostly housing-related energy consumption. And again, I think it's important to take into account the progressivity. I mean, this showed the importance to take into account the progressivity together with the change in tax burden, no? Because I mean, transport increased a lot, right? And it is regressive, but it is so little regressive that the redistributive effect is actually very small. Housing, on the other end, increased by far less, but it is so regressive. Then the distributive effect, it's far more adverse. You see that. Okay, and now let me move in this last 10 minutes to look at, I mean, having in mind these policy changes that took place, the tax benefit system overall, and the level of consumption taxation, to look at how consumption tax system and tax systems look in the EU at the end of these decades of policy changes. So, sorry, is there a way to move this up? Well, doesn't matter. So let me start with a picture of how the tax burden of consumption taxes varies across country. This is a snapshot of 2019. And we see that on average, household spent 14% of the disposable income in consumption taxes. But there is a large variance across country, right? And the reason and we see that in Eastern Europe, in this case, Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Lithuania, Latvia, consumption taxes have weights much more on household budget than in the richest EU countries, such as France, Sweden, Germany, and Luxembourg. The reason is not because in this country, in Eastern Europe, consumption taxes are always larger, but more because consumption, it's a larger share of household income in countries which has a lower income per capita, as it is in Eastern Europe compared to Western Europe. We then ask whether countries which have higher consumption taxes redistribute less. And we see that this is the case in fact, in most cases, right? So when we compare a distributive effect of the old tax benefit system, we see that countries, especially in Eastern Europe, which have higher consumption taxes, end up redistributing less than the rest. Although there are exceptions, such as Netherlands and Denmark, which have high and unequalizing consumption taxes, which, however, are more than compensated by a generous systems and well-targeted system of social transparency. And finally, we look again at the distributive impact by products. In this case, we are looking here at 2019, so we're looking at the level. What we looked at before was the change triggered by the reform in the post-financial crisis decade. Now, we take a snapshot of 2019, and we ask, at the end of the decade of these policy changes, what is the distributive effect of the taxation of the different category of consumption? This is for the EU as a whole, and then the next one is for each country by country. And we see that, and then we're going to see that this is a common pattern across the EU, that the most unequalizing consumption taxes are those falling on alcohol and tobacco, on food, and on housing-related energy, right? And that while transport, again, it's very large in size because of the taxation of vehicle fuel, its effect is not so negatively redistributive because transport is only slightly regressive. And in these slides, we see the same picture by country. Here it's a bit less visible, of course, because there are 27 of them, but let me guide you through it. So on the panel A, we show the regressivity of the various consumption of the consumption taxation across each member state as captured by the Kawani. And on the right-hand side, we look at the tax burden. So how much they weigh in household budget. And when you look at the pattern of regressivity, so the one which have the lowest Kawani are the most regressive, we see that the categories, right, that are most regressive are always food, which is the green one, alcohol, which is the gold one, and housing-related energy. And this is pretty much the same across all countries. And it's, although the relative ranking in some countries is food, in some other it's energy, but it's always these three. Most cases it's always these three that end up being the most regressive, right? And you see that the taxation on transport on the other end, it's only mildly regressive, and in some case, this is Romania, and go back to the rural versus urban pattern that I was mentioning before, where actually it is progressive. I think one thing that is interesting to notice is that in most Eastern EU, the most progressive taxation, see Lithuania, Latvia, what else? Romania, Poland. The most progressive tax is the one on food. And also it is the one that absorbs the largest share of household income. Again, look at Bulgaria, look at Latvia, look at Lithuania, and meaning that the taxation of food, it's the most unequalizing. And one of the reasons it happens that it's very regressive, and it's because, of course, the consumption of food, it's more important in household budget in Eastern Europe, but also because in many Eastern European countries, we have that food is taxed at the standard rate of taxation. So it's taxed at 20%, 22%, depending on the specific rate. Whereas in most Western European countries, we have the food typically subject to a reduced rate of VAT, which limits a bit there. And whereas what we see is that on the other end, in pretty much most other cases, is the taxation of housing energy, the most unequalizing form of consumption taxation, because it's regressive and because it has a relatively large impact on household budget. And that also, well, I'll stop here for the moment. So let me quickly wrap up, and then we move to questions. So, key point I want to make from this discussion and result presentation. First one is that these decades that we've been looking into, so the one of post-financial crisis, 2010-2019, we have seen a generalized increase in the tax burden in the EU. This tax burden was shared mostly in a progressive way because the effect of direct taxes was to positive redistribution, social insurance contribution, positive redistribution, as well as social transfers, which have decreased for the overall, but have increased for the bottom of the distribution, right? However, we've seen that everybody, including low-income households, have seen their income reduced at ceteris paribus. I mean, we've seen the income reduced as the result of this increase in taxation. So everybody is losing out. Consumption taxation have increased virtually everywhere. They also became more aggressive, especially because of increasing taxation of housing-related energy. And on the other end, social benefits were typically not sufficient to compensate low-income households. And we see limited evidence of tax shift. So in half of the member state, actually, direct taxes grew more than consumption taxes, right? So in a way, we see a picture where countries have been got halfway in following the indication of international institutions in terms of using consumption taxation. Yes, they have increased consumption taxation. Yes, they have increasingly used consumption taxes to penalize, to force consumers to internalize externalities associated with smoking, drinking, and using polluting form of energies. However, in most cases, they were not able to use social transfer to shelter the poorest, because social transfer were not enough, not increased enough to shelter the poorest. And also, in most cases, they did not shift the burden of taxation from consumption taxes. In most cases, what happened is that both forms of taxation increased. Looking at the picture at the end of these policy decades, we see that countries which uses more consumption taxes tend to redistribute less. And this is interesting because you see that there is a number of Eastern European countries, and Lithuania, Romania, Bulgaria, Estonia, all countries which have a combination of flat taxation of income, so not progressivity coming from direct taxation, very limited progressivity coming from direct taxation, combined with a pretty much flat system of VAT, such as all items, including the basic necessity good, food, are taxed at the standard rate. And that's why we see that, that we have that in several Eastern European countries, the level of distribution is relatively low. When we look both on average, but also in the experience of most EU countries, the effect of taxing different type of consumption, different product categories, we see that the taxation of housing-related energy, food, and tobacco and alcohol are the most progressive. And this we go back to the previous point I was mentioning. So in several Eastern European countries is a taxation of food, which is the most unequalizing, given that it is taxed at the standard rate of VAT, and also it has a high share on household budget. And overall, the most unequalizing are food and housing because they're also bigger in size. So in terms of takeaway for policy, this is my very last remark. Well, one I potentially already mentioned, no? So it has to do with the taxation of food. Taxation of food in Eastern Europe, no? We are in an environment of inflation. We're in an inflationary environment, potentially with accelerating inflation. We see in the moment in the months to come, which is eating particularly energy goods, but also in many cases food items. So, and given that taxation, given that VAT by its very nature tend to amplify any price shock, and given the unequalizing effect that it has in several countries, the taxation of food, there might be scope considering reduce their rate of taxation in those countries where VAT over food is particularly equalizing, and it represents a large share of household budget. The second lesson has to do with the redistribution, right? And with the fact that I was saying before that it seems that in these post-financial crisis decades, most countries got trapped halfway in implementing the policy recommendation. Yes, they increased a bit consumption taxation, but there was no tax shift in most countries. And on the other hand, while they did try to shelter the poorest by increasing social transfer, these social transfers were not enough to compensate the poorest. In many cases, actually, what happened is that the increase in consumption taxation more than wipe out the increase in social benefit. So this, I think, highlights the importance of undertaking ex-ante distributive analysis at the time of implementing policy reform, and in considering more closely the redistributive effect of policy. And this is, again, even more important now that we are in high inflation environments where a number of high necessity, no easy substitute goods such as energy and food are rapidly increasing in price. And the final one is go back to the tax shift, and it is to note once again that most member states have failed in shifting the burden away from direct taxes, from taxing labor, and the green transition, the European Green Deal, especially with the emphasis on setting new minimum, increasing the taxation basically on most polluting form of energy, could represent, again, an opportunity to reform the tax system of these countries, to contribute at the same time to employment, again, by reducing direct taxes, and also to European objectives in the area of, in terms of transition to net zero emission by 2050. So this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for the attention, and happy to take on any question.
Thank you, Mattia, for your very interesting presentation. It motivates a lot for very different discussion and detail on really interesting topics. In this sense, I think it's good to have a few minutes discussion at least for go into some specific details and questions. So I don't know if I would like to give the floor first to those attending online. So we extend the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. If there is anyone interested in asking, if not, I will be the opportunity to those attending in the room. So, Cesar?
Yes, unfortunately, I couldn't hear the beginning of the presentation, but I was very much interested in what you said towards the end. And I'd like a further explanation, if at all possible, on how can we account for the fact that it is precisely those Central European countries that allegedly they have enjoyed, quote unquote, a socialist culture of redistribution and equalizing policies, the ones that are most regressive precisely on the goods that are most necessary as food. Can you explain that, please?
Sorry, just to clarify, were you referring to Central European countries?
Yes, because you were mentioning Estonia, Lithuania, and so on. So, I mean, these countries had a long history, several decades history of socialist regime, which allegedly was much more into redistributing the rent so that the access to the basic goods could be easier for the less privileged sectors of the population. So to me, it's a sort of nonsense there. It's a sort of historical revenge or something strange. But I don't know how you could explain it.
No, thank you. I mean, there is definitely a pattern, no, and it's an interesting one. My take also for discussing with policymaker from those countries is that there is a moment in which these places, they see convergence with the rest of European countries. And one way of doing so was to create an environment with low direct taxes that could, that to attract businesses, right? And this is why, I mean, so many of them have a flat rate of taxation of 10, 15%. It is 10% in Romania. It is, I think, if I remember correctly, it is 15 in Bulgaria. Also, it's a pattern, right? And so a business-friendly patterns and also again, to incentivize activity, and on the other hand, trying to find way to overcome issue of informality in many sectors of the economy, and by taxing consumption, which is a tax that is also evaded, but less so than others, right? And so this combination of low income taxes together with high consumption taxation seemed a way to procure fiscal resources, no? While trying to catching up economically with the rest of the EU, and while trying to deal with the informality and tax evasion. And so if you look from that perspective, it has actually some historical policy reason, but also it has some non-trivial redistributive consequences when you look to the distributive aspect, right? And it is non-trivial that country in which food weighs so much on the budget of their own households because they are lower income, then they have this very item which is first necessity tax at the standard rate. Thank you.
So there is a hand raise in the online attendance. So I think it is Francisco Javier Brañas, but I'm not sure. So if you are listening to me, so Javier, yes, you have the floor to ask.
Do you hear me? Do you hear me?
Okay.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes?
A bit low.
A bit low. I am sorry, but I don't know how to manage the micro of my computer. Well, I will try, and then if somebody listen to me clearly, will explain my question to the speaker. First of all, congratulations for your presentation.
Thank you.
Congratulations, it's a very good work and a very good paper that you have presented to us, and then that confirms some of the tendency, there are a structural tendency in the tax systems. I raise a question to you. Listen to your results. I am very worried about the effects of the changes on energy, because if we are obliged, between quotes, to make an energy transition, a green transition, it worries me a lot, and I don't know if you share my view after attending your presentation, that there is a big problem, because the poorer the household, the more the tax burden of them. And if we would like to make an energy transition, how we manage this? And then I am very worried about that. I don't know if you share this worry that I am expressing in my question. Thank you.
Thank you, Francisco. I must say we had some issue with audio, so I'm just going to make sure that I got your question right. So I guess your question was, how do we manage a transition such as it can be equitable and green at the same time? So whether we can overcome this potential trade-off which is in there once we consider that the taxation of energy affect disproportionately, in many cases, households sitting at the bottom of the distribution. But this is your question, right?
Is my question. Yes, you got it. Thank you.
Okay,
yes,
I couldn't hear you, but I think the answer is yes. And if not, we exchange by email. If not, I make my question and I give my answer to myself. Listen, one thing that I would emphasize is that while there is indeed potentially a trade-off in this area, I mean, it's also worth considering that again, we need to take a holistic view and look at the tax system as a whole and not just the consumption taxation in isolation, right? So while it is true that taxes are a powerful signal and a powerful way to induce changes in consumption habit, and so they are liable to be used. On the other hand, we need to take into account their potentially regressive nature, but also that we have opportunity in the tax systems to compensate the poorest, right? And social transfers is one of them. And it's also the case that once you raise a tax rate, for example, those on energy, as part of the Green Deal, then you also have further fiscal revenues to use, right? And if the use of these fiscal revenues is targeted enough, in principle, this trade-off might be resolved, right? So I think it's also having, I think one side is having in mind both sides of the balance sheet. If you raise tax revenues, also have resources, and these resources can be used to compensate. This is one. And the second one is that there are also, again, opportunities. We were discussing before the case of Eastern European countries. No, we have opportunity already to make our tax system more progressive in many countries. No, imagine a country that has a flat rate of income taxation and then pass to a progressive income taxation, and at the same time is reducing, I don't know, consumption taxation on the most necessity goods. I mean, that there is an opportunity to redistribute, and raising taxes via taxing polluting form of energy also give you some other opportunity to redistribute by having fat resources. So I think while there is a trade-off, ex ante, I mean, ex post, there are many solutions. I'll stop here.
Jorge Rubia.
I enjoy very much your presentation. I would like very much the paper. I have 3 questions. Only I need information about your paper, no? With respect to the methodology of the statistical matching between the U-Silk and HBS, do you use a parametric matching? I understand, no?
We use a semi-parametric. Would you like me to say a couple of words on this? I have a slide.
No, I need my question is about the methodology in terms of the method to include the consumption in the recipient household. I understand the recipient household are the usual household. No?
Yes.
And you introduce you first estimate an Engels curves, no? The expenditure is explained about income and other attributes, no? Similar in the 2 database, no? In the HBS and U-Silk database, no? And the second stage, my question is, you introduce discretization about the different categories or to determine if there is a demand equal to 0 or equal to 1, and you criticize the consumers. My question.
Yes. Thank you very much, Jorge. So in terms of the statistical matching, I don't know, am I sharing my screen right now? Because I think this one would, well, I want to say a word, but I also have like a slides here that makes it, I think, I cannot share it anymore. If not, so while we are displaying this one, just to come back on your question. Yes, so we use a semi-parametric procedure which uses indeed angle curve in part, but only in part. And the reason that combines angle curve with matching, and the reason that we combine angle curve method with matching is that effectively what we have in HBS are consumption information at a quite detailed level. No, so it's COICOP level 4, which means the information about consumption for more than 200 good categories, right? So with such a level of disaggregation, then it is, if you cannot estimate the angle curve, right? If you do that, then basically the way to do it, and what people did in previous study, was to aggregate goods in, I don't know, 20 category, 20, you know, or 12 category, food as transport, and then you can estimate an angle curve.
The taxation of the BIT and extinction.
Exactly. And then that's how you can estimate the angle. But then what happened is that you lose the richness of consumption data that you have in the HPS. So to do that, what we do is basically a mixed procedure, which is semi-parametric, which combine angle curves with matching. So what we do is 3 steps. First, we identify common variable, as you said, in Silk and in HPS. Okay, we aggregate explanatory information in HPS, which are very detailed, in 20 macro category. Okay, and then here we estimate an angle curve, as you say. So we estimate an angle curve with, it's a 2-step regression. We also take into account the zero explanatory problem. Okay, but we estimate this predictive model. So it's made a regression model in HPS, which is an angle curve. No, we say, given the covariates, what is the consumption of each of these 20 consumption categories? No, so then basically we have an estimated predictive angle model, which for any covariate, which we have both in Silk and in HPS, tell us what is the predicted share of consumption in category 1, category 2, category 3, right? And then once we estimate this model, we can use to make prediction in both HPS and in Silk for each household, no? On what is their consumption share for each of these 20 categories, right? And so basically then we have a set of fitting consumption share for each household. For each household, we know, thanks to this model, what is their predicted consumption in each good category. Food as opposed to transport, as opposed to housing energy, etc. And the same in Silk. And this is the result of the angle curve. But then we use matching in the final step, right? Which is to say, we have predicted consumption expenditure for each household in each data set. And then we compare each household in HPS with each household in Silk, and we minimize their distance based on their
using a distance function.
Is it a distance function? Exactly.
Really, this hot-dex method.
Exactly. And then once we find the closest, we assign the full consumption basket. In this way, we can preserve the richness of the consumption information.
I understand.
Thank you.
And the second question is...
So I really went too much in...
Yes,
I didn't want to over-explain it. It just said it was for everybody else.
My method with Julio Lopez and Carmen Marin, I think that Carmen Marin explained you and the GRC our method using GLN estimators for to mitigate the heterostaticity problem to estimate angle curves. No, and we introduce a second stage with a probit method to discretize the columns into 43 categories, no? Combine the different BIT tax rate with specific and ad valorem, the specific rate in the exit taxes we converted to ad valorem taxes in the exit taxes. No,
okay.
We define 43 categories and we simulate the different tax liabilities of BIT and other exit taxes. No. We published this methodology in Journal of Applied Statistics in 2021. No? It's similar to method to André de Coster and Sabasakaran, but we changed the method to estimate the angle curve, because if you use OLS, the problem is the heterostaticity. And the retransformation of logs when you estimate the angle curve. But if you use GLM estimators, the problem of transformation is there is not, and the problem of heterostaticity is corrected.
Okay. Thank you. That's very good to hear. I will have a look at the question. Thank you.
It's an option. The second question is about the double effect of on overall redistributive effect when you change the tax mix. No, if you raise the direct taxation, the indirect taxation is 4. No, the problem is the regressivity of indirect taxation amplifies the effect of anti-redistributive effect. No, when you change direct taxes and you reduce the indirect taxes, the regressivity of the indirect taxes to amplify the Reynolds-Smolensky overall index. No, really is a relation. Zero-sum game is similar. No, when you increase the direct taxation, the redistributive effect of indirect taxation decreases. Automatic.
So I must admit, Jorge, I'm not an expert, so maybe we can follow up further later. When we look at the tax system as a whole, we measure the redistributive impact of each tax component with respect to market income, so a pre-concept income. So then I would say it's. I'm not sure if it is obvious to me. Then I would need to think about it. But what are how would the amplification effect works in changing the tax mix in terms of the Reynolds-Smolensky? But I don't have it on top of my mind, to be honest. I'm sorry.
So if there is no question, I think we have just a minute for the last question. If there is not, just
a quick one. Thank you, Mattia, for coming and for your presentation. If I understand correctly from a slide talking about policies, the only two countries where taxation income, consumption taxation decreased are Greece and Romania, right? Or, I mean, I saw that in every country, almost every country in the EU, this kind of taxation increased, right? Okay, do you know why?
See, so it's not Greece, it's Romania. There are let me go back. It's to share?
Okay.
I can tell you the case about Romania, which I think it's see. Thank you. So I think the case of let's look at the case of Romania, which is the most prominent, and I have also on top of my mind. So here you see that it's quite now it's quite evident, because in Romania it's the only country where not only indirect taxation reduced, but basically VAT reduced by 4%, which is quite large, nearly 4%. So there are two things. First of all, in Romania, there is a bit of an accounting issue, because Romania raised significantly direct taxation by 4 percentage points, so from 70%, the standard rate, to 21% in 2009, so just before this window that we are considering, as it sought financial assistance from the IMF during the financial crisis. And then what happened is that in the recovery time, so after 2014, Romania was probably, if not the only one, maybe one of the two that reverted this increase in direct taxation. Because what happened, we've seen most European countries, they raise VAT, standard rate of VAT, during the crisis period to enact fiscal consolidation policy measure. But then once out of the crisis, those tax rates remain there. No, and Romania was actually probably the only one that fully offset this raise in consumption in VAT. So in 2015, so before the end of the period, it reduced VAT back to 17% where it was. So since the increase is not captured because in 29, but the decrease is captured because it's within this window, then you see this reduction, okay? But I mean, while there is an accounting issue, there is also specificity. They were the only one in doing that, in reverting the tax hikes. So this is was one thing. Also, what happened in Romania is that, because Romania is special in many ways, you also see that, for example, it also, while reducing that consumption tax, also reduced direct taxes, right? And the issue is that while reverting the tax hikes, also what they did in 2014 is to adopt a new fiscal framework. And the new fiscal framework was based on reducing consumption taxes, reducing direct taxation, and increase social insurance contribution massively. And yes, and I mean, and politically, I can imagine why this is. Thank you.
Well, I think we have out of time right now. So thanks again for your presentation. I think a very interesting seminar for all of us. So thank you for coming here today and motivate us to go into the details on this topic. So congratulations.
And thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you.
We'll finish our seminar now. Thanks all of you for attending online to our seminar.